add some 4/Keith bar. So this is Rivulets, which is a 4-track granular processor. It uses four grain granular modules running in parallel. And the original idea was to try to create sort of a live action version of Tiny Orchestra, which is a time stretching patch that I put out a couple months ago. It doesn't quite hit that mark, but what came out I thought was pretty interesting in its own right. And it reminds me a lot of the sort of granular loop processing that a lot of early aughts ambient guitar players were working with, like Christian Finez or Jim O'Rourke, at least in a lot of its settings where it takes little snippets and adds texture and intrigue, let's say. Um, Before I go any further, because I keep putting this at the end of the video, I'm going to try putting it toward the beginning. If you end up downloading this patch and you enjoy it, please like it on Patch Storage. Do this for any patch that you download and enjoy. It seems like not a, very important thing, but it's a way for me to feel appreciated in a way that the community at large can see. It's a way of saying this is a cool patch to other people. So I really appreciate it a lot when people take that small step that means a lot to me. So, rivulets, back to that. The control panel is sort of laid out in a way so that if you look across this way, you've got individual controls for certain things, and then there's some global stuff. So the first global control is right at the top, which is texture. That's global for all of the granular modules, and it affects the amplitude envelope of the grains. At higher settings, it sort of smooths things out a little bit. I generally keep it parked at 1, but you can play around with it to get different textures. And then going down this column, there's pitches for each of the granular processors. And then going down this column, we have mutes. So if you just want to play with one of the granular modules, granular processors, you can. It's a good way to sort of thin things out. The patch can get pretty intense. You might hear that in some of the sound examples that I no doubt began this video with and conclude this video with. Then this column has to do with the grain size. You can, using this button, clock sync the grain size, which will sync it to this tap tempo, which is also MIDI clockable. It can be set here or here. And if you load this onto a ZBoo, the CV1 input will be connected to this clock too if you want to feed it an external clock source. So if you press this button, all of the channels, all of the tracks, all of the granular modules are synced to whatever this is. Now keep in mind that the granular modules have a grain size maximum of 1 second. So if you have something really slow, it's just going to max out at 1 second. But stuff underneath that, it'll try to sort of sync the grains to that tempo. Granular modules and beat syncing are a little bit weird, and this patch is not designed to do that particularly well. So if you are looking for that, you might need to find a different patch. It'll, I think, sort of capture the essence of the beat, sort of make it feel as though it's in the right cadence, but it's not going to perfectly line everything up to the, the clock beat. And then if you turn that off, you still have another option for syncing, which is to sync the grain size. And when that's turned on, this top grain size will control all of the tracks. It'll be sort of a master control, but when it's off, they have independent settings. So that's the grain size. Density works the same way. We've got this sync density control. When it's off, all of these have independent control, and when it's on, the top one determines the density for all of the granular processors. There's an LFO that scrubs through the position of the granular modules. This pixel here sort of shows its output, but you're most often going to have it pretty attenuated. So it's not going to be a real like dramatic dimming and brightening effect. I don't even know if that's coming through much in the video. I'm looking at it now and so. And we have a speed control for that LFO. It goes pretty slow. It doesn't go super fast because, the idea here is you want something that sort of slowly moves through the granular buffers. So it's not super fast, but its max speed is about 2 seconds, which is about twice the length of a granular buffer. So it'll there will be some effects to that. I'm not explaining it very well, but you can play around with it. That's okay. And then you have a range control for the scrubbing. The low position sets the minimum position that the LFO moves through and that the granular modules themselves are set to. And the high position or the high range sets the maximum. So you can sort of attenuate where it moves through those buffers. And I find that if you move it a little bit off the beginning, you get fewer artifacts as it scrubs. So I generally have it, like now at 0.2 and 0.33. It's a pretty narrow window, but that works for me. And really, the idea is to add some movement, some sense of, the buffers will sometimes contract and expand in ways that have an interesting effect. And then there's a spread control. The spread control applies to these bottom 3 processors or channels. Each time the channel is opened, the spread control will randomize their position in a pretty narrow range, but it adds a little bit more variety to the sound, I find. We have pitch jumps. So pitch jumps, I'm going to turn the guitar on for this. But I'm going to mute all the channels except for one. That makes sense. So pitch jumps, it determines the likelihood that any of the channels, this is a global control, but it's applied on each clock beat for them individually. It's a probabilistic control. How likely they are to jump up or down a certain amount that's set by the pitch range. So right now it's set to an octave. Let me turn up the likelihood. We're hearing it jump up an octave sometimes. And that rate is clock divided. It's based on the tap tempo or the MIDI clock, but you can set a division of the clock for that. So if we wanted it to be a little more zany, let's say, should turn up the density. It's not recording when I want it to record. The recording process, there we're getting some more of that. You can play around with it. It's more prevalent when you've got a lot of channels going and the recordings occur more often. Um, One last thing before I get off of the pitch jump is you can rectify it too. And what that means is that this control, the way that it's working when it's unrectified, is it'll jump up or down an octave. This range sets a positive and negative amount that it jumps. When it's rectified, the control only sets the control shows the amount it'll jump. So if you only want to jump up one octave and none of that jumping down an octave, you would rectify it. And this control can go into negative ranges. So if you want it to, go down, you can do that too. I'm going to turn it off. The density control determines how often recordings are played back. And I'm just going to sort of skip over the technical stuff. Well, no, I won't. It has a relationship with this fade amount. So you can fade in the frozen buffers that are played back, the frozen granular buffers that are played back. And based on how this is set, it will affect the density in certain ways, because the density, new material can only be recorded when the envelopes that control the output of the buffers, the granular modules, reach zero. So when the fade is set high, it's more likely that even as they start to decay, a new signal to open them comes in, which will keep whatever's in their buffer in there. So you can have some rise and fall effects without changing the contents of the buffer if the fade is set high. The fade is determined by this clock amount. So, with slower clocks, you get longer fades and so on. At 100 or 1.0, it's 2 times the clock cycle. It's twice as long as the clock cycle. At 0.5, it's 1 times the clock cycle, and below that, it's less than that. But the fade is a nice way of adding some drama to this effect. If you turn the fade all the way off, you can get some very interesting glitchy sounds, but things come in and out rapidly. So the density controls playback, but it's also affected by the fade controls. So the higher the fade, the more likely it is that playback sort of gets extended, let's say. At 0, nothing is recorded. At 1, in theory, nothing new should be recorded. Whatever is in the buffers will be held there indefinitely. I like a point, in this like 25 to 75% range, depending on what I'm going for and how intense the effect is and what the fade setting is. There is a ducking control. The ducking is a little weird. I'm going to be honest about that. I didn't have the CPU to use something like an envelope follower, which might have provided a more natural ducking effect. This uses the envelopes that are generated to fade in and out and control the amplitude of the granular modules. So it's depending on density and some other stuff, a granular or just the, your input might be quiet, but the envelope might trigger. So you can be ducked by silence depending on what this is. And it's also like a pretty intense control. And what I mean by that is it's set up in such a way that if you only have one channel active, if all three of these are muted, you can still duck the input all the way when it's set to 100 or 1.0 or whatever, full amount. But that means that when more than one channel is active, you want to keep it much lower than that because they're all cumulative. So it adds up all of those inputs and then affects the dry signal. It ducks out the dry signal. But in sort of subtle amounts, I find it's a really nice way to sort of make the output of the module and the input blend together. So it's just about sort of finding that sweet spot, which for me, when all four of the channels are open, is usually somewhere between 0.15 and 0.2. But you can play around with it. And then we have dry level and wet level. And on the second page, I already showed you the clock divider. And that's the sort of performance controls, the UI for the patch. So like I said, it's not the patch that I set out to make, which is still an interesting topic for me to pursue. You may see me do something else in pursuit of that idea. But it really, to me, when I started playing around with it, like I said, reminded me of that sort of early aughts guitar plus Max, stuff that particularly Finesse was doing at the time. It's not modeled after any of that. It sort of accidentally fell into that space. So, I'm sure there are ways to more accurately represent that, but it's in that sort of ambient, glitchy, not quite loops, granular space that was being explored at that time and which shaped a lot of my aesthetics around ambient music, I guess. So, I hope you check it out and maybe that point of reference isn't too far off base and you don't go like, what the hell are you talking about? But yeah, that's Rivulets. Rivulets. A patch I can write better than I can pronounce it. Have a good day. So in this example, I'm going to use Rivulets a way I like to use it a lot, which is just as sort of a textural enhancer. I've got two of the modules muted. I've got the other two synced to this grain size from the first channel. The densities are separate. One of these is pitched an octave up and it's a little bit less dense so that you'll hear it as sort of like a rhythmic texture more than a sustained sound. The LFO is going medium speed. The pitch jumps are set to just a little bit off of unity. And there's a little bit of fade and a little bit of ducking, and the density is so-so. I'm going to play it for a little bit, and then I'm going to pretty quickly add on my patch for Keith Bard in the delay mode. And I'll probably add in the other two granular modules at some point to complement the sound. So this is what it sounds like without the delay. Now let's add in a little bit of this delay. And just dry again. So this example is a little bit like the last one. Mostly I'm saying that because I'm going to use 4-Keith bar in delay mode again to accentuate it. But what I have here is all of the granular modules having their own grain size. They all have their own density. Two are set to unity pitch. One is an octave below. I'll change that to a fifth below. A fifth below, and one is an octave above. The pitch jumps are set to 1 octave, and we're gonna dial them in just a little bit. The fade is pretty low. The ducking is pretty low. So that's sort of where we are. And this is, I think, in sort of the glitchy territory of Christian Finesse or Jim O'Rourke or something like that from the early aughts, with some of their uses of computer programming to accentuate what they were doing with guitar and other instruments. So let's add some 4-Keith bar. Let's switch everything back to max density. I'm just syncing this. Let's bring up the density a little bit. I'm just going to drop the clock divider. So in this example, I've got something a little bit more out there. Uh, so I've got the grains synced to the clock speed. Two of them are pitched at unity. One is pitched up, one is pitched down an octave. The pitch jumps are set to 1 octave, so they'll jump +1 octave and -1 octave. So we're going to get a pretty big range here of 4 octaves between all of the granular modules. And the clock divider is set really fast. It's set to 10 times. There is no fade applied. There's some ducking applied. And the density is pretty low. I'm going to turn that up as we go on. So here's what it sounds like. Let's turn the density up a little bit. I'm going to turn the ducking up. You won't hear much of my dry signal at this point, but it'll cut through sometimes very abruptly because there's no fade applied. So. So that can get pretty wild. I'm going to cut down on the density now just by switching all of these to individual controls. Let's cut back on the ducking. So in this example, I've got this sort of set to a very, I think, pastoral application of the patch. Let's say we've got a pretty long fade time, which will affect how often sounds sort of fade out and then come back because they're picked up again. All of our grain sizes are synced to this control, which sets it at the max grain size, max density. Two of these are set to unity pitch, and one is an octave up and one is an octave down. There's no pitch jumps applied. The LFO is pretty slow right now. So. And I'm going to add in some reverb from 4 Keith bar in the reverb setting.